Hello, folks. Welcome aboard. It is 1 o'clock here on Wednesday, the first day of June. I like to think of today as summer's beginning, but it has been quite warm. So we've been living the summer life for a little while, and we're on the other side of Memorial Day weekend. So let's celebrate. We made it to the nice weather, even though today is not nice. My name is Martin Daly. I'm the Director of Water Quality Programs for the Capital District Regional Planning Commission. Before we get underway, I do want to tease two things that CDRPC is offering. The first item, if I can get my screen to cooperate, is our technical assistance program. We offer technical assistance to municipalities within the 4-county region that we serve: Albany, Schenectady, Rensselaer, and Saratoga, on planning and land use projects that are really small scale, perhaps a corridor improvement, or looking at changing the design of a particular roadway and its potential impacts on walking or bicycling, the economic impacts or land use impacts from a corridor plan. So this is a great product. It's an open application, and we are soliciting communities to apply to this program. The second thing I'll take a moment to tease is we have our Erastus Corning II Awards for Intermunicipal Cooperation. This is a chance for us to shine a spotlight on projects and programs that are happening within the region and celebrate the good work that municipal partners or nonprofits are doing in the areas of economic development, water quality, equality, environmental justice, community and regional sustainability, or innovation and technology to deliver planning products to communities. So if you know of a product that is reaching across municipal boundaries and you want to celebrate the efforts that have been engaged in, this is a great opportunity to shine a spotlight on that particular project. So with that, before we begin our session, a couple of notes about how we operate. Our attendees join with their cameras off and muted for security purposes, but we really do want your engagement throughout this 1-hour session. We have two functions that you can submit your questions. You can use the chat function or the Q&A function, and I'll be sure, very much like a radio DJ, to relay those questions to our guest, Michael, today. We also will post this webinar on YouTube, so it is being live streamed and it will be archived on the Eventbrite page, the same page that you use to register and access for the webinar series. All of our webinars are archived on that page. 1 hour after the webinar, we will have an email that will go out to confirm your attendance. If you're looking for your planning and zoning credits, you can take that email, submit it to your municipality, and that will provide evidence that you have attended today's session. For folks that are AICP, you can look up this session on the American Planning Association website. It does have a CM number attached as well, and so you can use that to submit for your 1 hour of credit maintenance. Okay, with all of the housekeeping out of the way, I'm really excited today because we have Michael Andolo joining us from the MRB group, and he is going to be talking to us about renewable energy projects, best management for municipal leaders. Communities must adapt their policies and processes to meet new challenges, including the significant surge in solar projects happening across the state. At least here in the capital region, I'm aware of multiple large-scale solar projects going forward in multiple different stages in communities around the capital district. There's always some consternation or some questions about those projects and how they move forward. Developers proposing solar projects have tested limits of municipalities who were not prepared for that type of development review or related impacts on the community. From a land use regulation side to proper siting and creating payment in lieu of tax programs, pilots that make sense, this session will discuss what many local government leaders have learned from direct experience and how your local government can better prepare your community for alternate energy and smoothing the road and review process so there's better engagement from developers and better consultation when it comes to community input for those types of projects. So I want to thank Michael for joining us. I want to thank the MRB group for sponsoring this series. Sponsors and speakers make this possible. We would not be able to deliver these programs without the generous support of our sponsors and speakers. So thanks, Michael, for taking the time to join us this afternoon, and I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Very good. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. I'm going to do the dreaded screen share here and hope that it all works out. All right, there we go. So welcome to this session. I will start off by saying, if you're one of the few communities that hasn't already come to face a solar or a solar interest or a solar project under development or proposed, you're one of the rare ones and you will soon get one. So I can understand why people would be interested in this, because it's just every one of our clients out there is facing this and asking themselves, what do we do? What do we need to be proactive about this? Do we need to just wait till someone comes to us? Do we need to be adapting our policies right now? Should we just wait and see what they offer? You know, and the answer is, you probably want to be proactive. As you can imagine, it's better to plan ahead. I know I'm speaking to planners predominantly. Plan ahead and not wait for the last minute here. I will say that a lot of communities facing this are, well, there's a wide range of communities that are facing this. Some of them are related to rural areas, but we're seeing increasing interest even in suburban areas, and to some extent in urban even environments. There's some solar pressure, believe it or not, that's happening. And some interesting things happening in the brownfield redevelopment area as well. But this particular talk today is going to be about solar projects and how communities can be adapting their local laws, their regulatory framework, and their policies to really best match the needs of the community with the changing environment around solar energy. Now, I have said already, and I'll restate here, I'd love it if people ask questions along the way. I'm perfectly happy to take them during the course of the presentation. So if you have them, please put them in the chat, please put them in the Q&A, be happy to answer them as we go. I will say just a quick little thing on MRB Group. One of the reasons that you're seeing me today is we represent the communities that have the largest solar projects in the state. Well, not the largest, but I think we have 5 or 6 of the 10 largest proposed solar arrays in the state. And we have probably 40, literally 40 communities that we work in that are dealing with solar right now. I work in a special division of MRB Group, which is the Smarter Local Government. And we are the folks that are not engineers and not architects. There's plenty of those in our group that do lots and lots of municipal work, but I'm here on the community development, economic development, planning, and other related services to that, where we serve all over upstate New York, Texas, and South Carolina. We have a budding presence in South Carolina, so we're seeing this from many different angles, both within New York and outside of it. We just finished a project for Tioga County, which it forms a lot of the basis of these of the recommendations that we're going to give you, where we had to think as a team. You know, if we had a client come to us and say, give us all your recommendations, well, that's what we just did for Tioga. So you can see my mug up here. I have it from the economic development point of view, Tracy from the project management, and previously she was with an IDA, ran 2 IDAs, and an economic development corporation and a chamber of commerce. So she's coming at it from sort of the general community point of view, and she was quite helpful in the project. And Sean, who's our technical review planner, also contributed to this. So I just want to give them credit where they're due here. That Tioga project, just so you're aware, if you can see over on the right-hand side of the screen, mrbgroup.com/solar. I'm going to quickly bring up that web page. I just want to make you aware of that. Again, that's mrbgroup.com/solar, which is the page I'm showing right now.
And I did put that in the chat, Michael. So people, if you're looking for a direct link to that, that is in the chat for folks.
Great, great. Thank you. We have tons of good resources here. I will say there's a little blurb about what we did at the bottom of that. If you click the read more, there's a very comprehensive report that'll cover all the details I'm covering today and a lot more. On the left here, we have example abandonment and decommissioning plans, operation and maintenance plans, battery storage law. We have solar development considerations that you should be aware of, and some general information about the special use permit process, which we recommend for solar development. So back to the main show here. On this, the kind of the purpose of today's call here, or I guess presentation, there's a few topics about agrivoltaics that we want to cover very briefly at the beginning. It's a topic we get a lot of questions about. And then the more broader topic of farmland protection, of which we'll cover later on. Pilot negotiations, payment in lieu of taxes. This is your tax abatements. Always a hot topic of discussion. Should we be giving pilots? If we do, what should they look like? Who should we be talking? How should we benchmark them? And then a long discussion about the best practices as a local government with respect to land use, policy, local law, regulation, and then some topics specifically around that decommissioning. We found that decommissioning is a topic that communities know very little about. It's not a normal thing in the regulatory review. Well, seldom is it a normal thing in the regulatory review process, but it's actually potentially quite important for solar. So that's the agenda for today. Agrivoltaics is a fun topic because people are, rightfully concerned about farming. And really the question is, how can we encourage both farming and solar development? Is that possible? Agrivoltaics is one of the ways. We'll talk about other ways that you can do it. And all that means is, how can we have on a single parcel of land, both the solar use and the agricultural use, keeping that diversification, keeping income streams coming into the farmer for both activities. We did a bunch of research on this topic, and we've seen many examples of this. There are certain food crops that do work well. There are ones that either need shade or benefit from shade, or need special care that requires kind of a cleared area, but where the presence of solar panels isn't going to impose a hardship. So we list a couple there: peppers, lettuces, and herbs. And then the big one, of course, is grazing. We've seen grazing just about everywhere, both bovine grazing and sheep grazing. We do not recommend goat grazing because goats love to eat things like wires, and they also love to jump on things like solar panels. So we cannot recommend goats, but certainly sheep are very typical, especially in the Amish and the Mennonite communities. And then of course, grazing from cattle. We note that almost every solar array of any significant size is already protected by a fence, which makes it easy for grazing purposes. You don't have to install a fence or maintain anything unusual that isn't already there. Unfortunately, what we found in most of upstate, that the predominant crops are corn and hay, of course, and other types of grains. They don't work so well, at least for right now. We can't recommend pushing that, but there are, of course, the intensive and specialty crops that I just mentioned before. Under the recommendations tab here, our heading, I'm going to talk about some zoning and permitting issues later on that help you as a community limit the amount of prime soil that's devoted to a solar array and therefore not available for other types of things. But I will say that if you did have a limit on that, you can add into your limit to say that if you do practice agrivoltaics, then those acres that are subject to agrivoltaics are not subject to this limit, right? So if a farmer is going to set aside 5 acres for solar and 3 of those acres will have agrivoltaics, well, there's only 2 acres that are subject to this prime soils condition that we'll talk about later. We certainly hope we can have continued crop production and some other things that are related to agriculture that you could use and encourage, beekeeping for pollination and so on like that. And then using it for native plant propagation in particular, and to help kind of shut out invasive species. So that's all I'm going to say on agrivoltaics, because that's very still much under development, and we haven't seen, other than what I mentioned, we haven't seen a lot of success. So the topic here, pilots and host community agreements or host benefit agreements or community benefit agreements. Everyone calls them a little bit different. We're going to call them host community agreements. These things are very much talked about a lot right now, and there's some changes that I'll talk about to these in the next slide. But just so everyone knows, pilots are payment in lieu of tax agreements. It's where you make a property tax exempt, so it doesn't pay property tax, and instead it pays a pilot, a payment in lieu of tax agreement, of basically a fee that's established under a schedule. Unlike many other projects, you actually have two ways to do pilots. There's a special renewable energy pilot that a municipality can do by adopting a local law to opt into that. And an IDA, an industrial development agency, can also induce a pilot agreement for a solar project. Why would you do one over the other? I will say by adopting the 47, you get to have kind of an almost like an as of right, not quite, but it just streamlines the process. So anybody that comes to you with a solar can opt into that pilot. That pilot, however, is pretty restrictive. It can be for no more than 15 years, and it is only dealing with property tax, right? So you would choose the municipality route if you want to use solar across your community, and if you want an easy way for solar developers to get in. IDAs have more flexibility. They can do an unlimited number of years of pilot, and they can offer sales tax exemption. They can also offer a mortgage recording tax exemption, but typically solar projects don't, because of the nature of the financing, don't have mortgages and don't really apply a mortgage to it. And the pilots are by default, both the municipal pilot and the IDA pilot are distributed on a pro rata basis, which just simply means, if your school district represents 2/3 of your tax bill, then 2/3 of the pilot will go to the school district, and the remainder will go to the town and the county or any special districts. I will say that, although now that I said that, special districts aren't subject to the pilot, so they will be paid irrespective of pilot. They will be paid the property tax based on the special district tax rate in question. You can distribute a pilot other than pro rata. Sorry, I just had a little phone issue there. You can do it other than pro rata if all the taxing jurisdictions agree to that. Host community agreements. The reason why you do a host community agreement, they're optional, and we would typically suggest to avoid a host community agreement for anything other than a very, very large solar project, something 20 megawatts or greater in nameplate capacity. But the reason why is that, as I alluded to earlier, in a pro rata distribution, the school district typically gets the lion's share of the resources coming off the pilot. A host community benefit agreement, you can direct extra resources to the town. So you can, if the town or city or village, if they're going to incur some kind of special cost and you want them to be able to capture the benefit, a host community agreement is the way to do it. You can do it as a single. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I'm trying to pick my spot.
Yeah, go ahead.
We had a question in the chat function. I'm just going to read it, and
yeah,
you can follow along. In regards to the decommissioning plan, solar developments in this person's county have started to stop including recycling arrays, but disposal as recycling solar arrays has not gotten much momentum as it is not currently economical feasible at this time. The disposal may be seen as a regional impact. Do you know of any county planning boards who review decommissioning or disposal in their 239M review, as a panel changeout is closer to 6 to 7 years old rather than 20 to 25?
Boy, there's a lot to unpack in that question. Yeah. So the answer is typically not at the county level, but we very much recommend that be addressed at the local permitting level on a special use permit basis. So that's the first bit. I'll say I would recommend town, city, village, whoever it is that's doing the review, definitely consider decommissioning, including disposal. The second aspect of that is what we have seen a couple of solar project developers attempt to do is to state that there is a salvage value to the solar panels that should offset their decommissioning cost. We recommend that be rejected if that is posited by the developer, for the very reasons that the questioner said. Right now, we don't have an established price. We don't have an established value for recycling, much less salvage value for reuse. And really, until that's established, we would not recommend assuming that there is a salvage value. So it's a great question, though.
Thanks.
Okay, so just to round out the last bit of host community agreement, you can do it as a single payment if there's some kind of cost up front to the community, or if there's annual costs, you could do it as an annual payment. But what we tend to think about is that it's not additive to the pilot. And all that means is that if the project can support, just as an example, if the project can support $5,000 of payment per megawatt, all right, and I'm just giving that as an example. If you have $1,000 per megawatt going to a host community agreement, then the pilot's going to be $4,000. You're not going to get $5,000 plus $1,000. You're going to get $5,000 total. So again, the host community agreement, we feel, is more useful about redirecting those pilot dollars than it is adding to the pilot dollars. And I think I covered the rest of the stuff on this slide here. So I'm going to move on. Pilot structuring. So there's a few considerations when you're dealing with a pilot. This is both for a municipal pilot under 47 or a IDA pilot. Number one, you have to be consistent. As long as you're consistent, it will be very unlikely that you are challenged as to the pilot itself. If, however, there's some indication of favoritism or arbitrary and capricious, so to speak, in the language of the lawyers, you would want to be very careful to make sure that you don't run afoul of treating one party substantially different than the other. We also don't want a pilot to be masquerading as public policy. So we don't recommend, if there's something that you can put into your local law as part of a land use regulatory process for the approvals, put it in your local law. Don't try to use the pilot as a battering ram to say, we're not going to give you a pilot unless you do X, Y, Z. We're not going to give you a special use permit unless you do X, Y, Z. That works, but we don't want to use the pilot for land use planning, okay? And I'm going to appear to contradict myself later on, but I promise you, I don't think there's a contradiction in this, and you'll see later on. The administrative fees can be charged by a IDA to administer the pilot. And there's a certain capacity, as I mentioned earlier, capacity of the solar array is typically an indicator of how much they can pay in pilot, and that is done on a per megawatt basis. So what are our recommendations beyond those considerations? I'm actually going to strike this first bullet point here. NYSERDA calculator 2 is not going to be a good path. And I'll get into that later in just a little bit here. But in general, we're seeing in upstate, outside of the Hudson Valley, and outside of a couple very specific areas in upstate, generally seeing $5,000 to $6,000 per megawatt is what a pilot payment will. It's what one of these will support. On top of that, so if you have a 5 megawatt project, you're getting $25,000 up to $30,000, whatever it is, per year, total in pilot payment. Put on a 2% escalator per year, for the life of the pilot. It's a 15-year term if you're doing it through the municipal pilot. It can be anything under the IDA pilot, just about anything under the IDA pilot. And then there are some monitoring requirements if you use it for disincentivizing certain things, and that's later on we'll talk about. I would avoid an HCA where possible. We're just not talking about enough money to make it worth it to go through all the legal costs of negotiating a host community agreement. So if you can do it with the pilot, just do it with the pilot. And again, don't use the pilot for local law related items. We also surprisingly would just recommend just wholly exempting any project that's under 1 megawatt. It's not worth your legal fees to negotiate a 1 megawatt where you're only going to be getting $5,000, $6,000 a year. You'll burn through that in legal fees very quickly. However, I will say the last point on here. Anybody who's been involved in solar knows that the assessment of solar projects has been totally out of whack with what they actually can pay. The state has recently changed the assessment methodology. And now the assessment methodology is done, I won't get into the details of it, but it's a discounted cash flow. All that means is that whereas a 5 megawatt project would have been assessed up here under the previous assessment methodology, now that same solar array will be assessed under this new methodology at a much, much lower level. And why is that important is because until now, every project needed a pilot, every project, because otherwise they'd just be bleeding property tax, and there's no way to make them financially feasible. Today, with this new assessment methodology, we're seeing those assessments come in much lower, and the need for a pilot is much lower. And this $5,000 to $6,000 per megawatt, they may actually be paying less than $5,000 to $6,000 per megawatt under the assessment, and therefore we may no longer need pilots. I still think we're going to get them because people want certainty, and you can get certainty with a pilot, and you can't get it with an assessment methodology. But we'll see if that comes to pass. Pilots may simply be no longer needed. It's possible. All right. Cost benefit analysis. This is kind of a specialized thing here, but a lot of communities want to do a cost benefit to say, hey, why should we give a pilot, or why should we permit this project at all for the community? Why should we allow this project to happen, or why should we give them a pilot? There's a bunch of things to think about. I'm not going to talk much about cost benefit. It gets kind of complicated, but there are some investments. During the construction, we have found that very, very little of the actual construction impact happens locally. It almost all goes out to solar panel manufacturers and solar component manufacturers that aren't in your county or city. And it's really just the installers, and even some of them are non-local labor. So that is not necessarily a huge consideration. For any project that's a community solar project, which is like 5 megawatts or less, you're probably not going to get any jobs. You're going to get a maintenance contract. You're going to get an occasional person that comes to the site. I will say that the one thing that I would say is a huge benefit, I think, is yes, you get some tax revenue, which is great. And I think every community will take more tax revenue versus less tax revenue. It's not a huge pot of gold, but it's some. But the other one is it really is help supporting farmers. There's a lot of farmers that are kind of on that margin that may not have a profitable venture. If they can throw some solar panels down, they can keep the farm, and they're more likely to pass that on to the next generation. It just makes farming more profitable. So that's my pitch for the cost benefit bit. All right, now on to the meat, which is local government role in the regulatory framework. What are all the things that your government could be doing moving forward? Did we have a question? Oh, no, okay. Oh, you're on mute.
No, just popping in, sorry.
Okay, good. Okay, so what are the ways that you are, what are the ways that you bring your government regulatory framework to bear? Obviously, you have your local zoning ordinance, right? You have your special use permit / site plan review process, right? That's another way. There's the applicability of the building code. That's another regulatory framework that you have. And then of course there's seeker. We're not going to really cover seeker because seeker is what it is, and I'll let the lawyers battle over that. But we really want to talk about on the local law and special use permit in particular, kind of those frameworks. So as a refresher, I'm sure everybody on this call probably already knows this, but you have different types of uses in your zoning code. You have, for each zoning district, there's a principal use, one or more principal uses. There's often an accessory use here or there, a secondary use, and a special use. And solar really can fall under any of those categories. Again, it's depending how you set up your zoning code. Principal use, like if you're saying, hey, it's allowable in this district as a principal use. Okay, great. Where that's essentially the sole use on the site other than accessory use. You have an accessory use where that's more like your kind of your typical, solar mounted array on a house or something like that, where it's not really the use of the property. It's totally, separate from the principal use, but it's, related to it. The secondary use where you might be generating some economic activity on site, but it's not the principal use. And then special use, where there's these conditions that it's not allowed as of right. There are special conditions that have to be met under the zoning code in order to allow it. So we recommend, as I mentioned before, that probably the best option we think for communities is to consider it a special use under their zoning districts, whatever zoning districts they want to put it in. Special use permit, authorizing something in a way that's not going to inordinately negatively impact adjacent uses or other aspects of the zoning district. So what's the special use permit application process? You can use special use permits. The local law has to set forth those special use permit uses that are subject to it. And then interestingly enough, you can designate what entity will issue the special use permit. I see it most often at the planning board level. I did not actually know prior to talking to my expert that a zoning board could issue a special use permit, but apparently that does happen, which I think is interesting. And maybe that just shows my ignorance. And then a special use permit can also be granted by the legislative body itself under those circumstances. So, excuse me. So there are different scales of solar. And our recommendation, I said earlier, special use permit, I'm only referring to the larger systems, the ones that are the ground mounted, not the solar, not the roof mounted, and not the small arrays. So think about, from a sizing point of view, an array that would serve the electric use on site that is either roof mounted or ground mounted. Probably you're going to want something like that that's up to a certain level, could be exempted from review and just allow an administrative review. But the larger systems, again, I think a special use permit is probably the way to go. It's going to be more rigorous, and it's going to allow you to impose certain conditions on the approval that will help you out in later time when you're moving forward with the actual project. So a reminder that, of course, a special use permit, you got to have a public hearing. Public hearings have to be noticed. They have to be held within a certain time period of receiving an application. That really should see an application that has been deemed complete, of course, right? And then you have to mail the notices out. And then you're supposed to have a determination within 62 days of the hearing. Of course, I will say that in a lot of cases, there's a mutual consent between the applicant and the entity granting the special use permit to extend that if there's still things under review and if there's still considerations that the community wants to hash out. So some items here just to refresh everybody. Some of these things you probably already asked for, but there's some things on here you probably don't ask for. So under your special use permit regulations, we would suggest that you include obviously the site plan set, which everyone thinks that's always going to be included. Pre-development site conditions. This is kind of special for solar because on your decommissioning plan, you're going to want to stipulate that the site conditions be restored to what they previously were. So you have to have some kind of documentation of what the pre-development site conditions are. So that's kind of interesting. Construction schedule, very typical. Everybody knows the drainage mitigation plan and so on like that. That has to happen. Equipment specification sheets. This can be useful if there's ever an issue in the future so that you can document. These are kind of like your as-built plans, right? You want to have the specifications so you can refer back to them. Decommissioning plan, we're going to talk a lot about at the end of this presentation. An operation and maintenance plan, there's some non-obvious things that you might want to consider there. Parking and traffic. You say, well, what are you talking about there? This is a solar array. Well, it's the parking and traffic during construction, right? So we're not expecting a lot of parking and traffic during the operations, but during the construction period. View shed is very typical. A noise study, again, just during construction. And then all of the various things that are required under seeker that you're going to want to have included in there. If you want to go the host community agreement, you can stipulate that under local law. It doesn't have to be in your local law, but you're better off stipulating that. And then of course road use. And I'm not stating the other obvious things, like there's obviously a county review if it's on a county road and so on.
Michael, when you talk about the special use permit considerations, are there post-construction management requirements that a municipality needs to be aware of as far as a maintenance plan or a post-construction stormwater management plan for these sites?
Yeah, absolutely. All of those things and a few other things that we would recommend as well. I have a slide coming up that that'll cover some of those things. But yeah, you mentioned a few of them, like a vegetation management. You want to make sure that you have something there. You don't want this thing to, you don't want this thing to be an eyesore. And if you have it if you have it as part of your operational plan, then it's something that's enforceable on the back end. So you want to make sure that you include those things. I do have a slide coming up, though, I think that covers some of those.
Awesome. All right.
This is, again, fairly obvious stuff that I think most people on this call know. If you impose a condition, it's part of the approval process as when the building permit is issued or certificate of occupancy is issued. Conditions can hit at either one of those levels. And it's all about protecting the community interest during construction and during operations. And just make sure that you don't exceed your authority with respect to the user. You can guide the use, but not the user. So I think everyone is fairly familiar with these, so I won't cover that. So what are the kinds of things in solar? You have your typical things like lot coverage and setbacks. Height requirements, there's very little height other than, I mean, the highest thing is probably going to be the inverters on there. But there might be actually a few things related to security, like there may be a camera system or something like that. So if height is important, that's something there. Landscaping buffering can be very important depending on your community's view towards solar. Sort of stating the obvious, but some people have a negative reaction to seeing solar panels and some people have a positive one. And if you want landscaping and buffering, obviously you're going to want to have that specified. Fencing, we do recommend for security reasons and also for that agrivoltaics use that you have good fencing. Noise study, we already covered. Glare study, that is something that has been reported in other cases where there could be a negative impact related to glare, and that's something that can be followed up with. Prime soils and farmland of statewide importance. So we're seeing kind of an interest again in how do we preserve, as we move to a renewable energy economy, how do we preserve prime soils and farmland? I'll cover this later, but I will just say right off the bat, we're seeing some kind of neat things around how to marry the two in your regulatory process. And one I'll just give away right away is to say, you might not want to go whole hog and say you can't put any solar on any prime soil or farmland of statewide importance, right? That would be somewhat extreme, I think, again, because part of the reason of having solar in a community, one of the reasons could be how to help a farmer diversify income streams and maintain the use of the farm. But one of the things you can say is you can say, hey, well, no more, if you look at the footprint of your solar project, that footprint can be comprised of no more than 40% of that footprint can be prime soils, right? So you can encroach a little bit on the prime soils and maybe have a mix, right, of prime and non-prime. And that's another reason why you need that existing conditions report, is to know where the prime soils are and something like that. But that's one way to kind of maybe a middle path between an outright ban and a do whatever you want kind of thing, is to say, okay, maybe 40%, maybe 50% is the maximum, whatever it is. Got to have your SWIP. Decommissioning will cover, and the soil testing is related to two things. One is soil testing if you're going to use soils as a condition that I just described, but also for the decommissioning plan, you need soil testing so that when the decommissioning happens, you can verify that the soil was returned to its previous composition. All right, O&M. So operation and maintenance plans, it's what's required to keep this thing running. So vegetation management is one. You can't have these things overgrown, so, and you don't want to have an eyesore, so you have to have some expectation in your operation and maintenance plan of what the interval is for vegetation management, for example. These solar plans, these solar projects do have to be cleaned. You can see in the little image there that they get dirty, they lose production. You would assume that solar companies would want to keep those things clean, but it's just better to have it in your operation and maintenance plan, what the interval is and how often they're going to be done. If you have certain conditions in your solar, in your operation and maintenance plan, or your, I should say, special conditions related to the special use permit, that requires a town employee to be able to access the site and walk the site, then you're going to need an operation and maintenance plan that includes the fact that twice a year that person's going to be on site or whatever it is, and the vegetation has to be cleaned up to the point where the person can actually get on the site and get around the site. Roadway approaches, and I'm sorry, one other thing I didn't mention earlier is, after construction period, rehabilitating any roadway or any disturbed soil or any changes to stormwater flows that happen during construction, putting them back to their original condition. So these are the components of an operation and maintenance plan, what the staffing level is. Again, for a 5 megawatt or lower, there's basically not going to be staffing other than contract labor that comes in from time to time. What the contingency plan is or warranty if there's a failure of the system, how they're going to address that, and in what time period they're going to address those equipment failures. If there's an unscheduled maintenance, how that's going to be handled and permitted, if it's necessary to pull a permit. With battery storage, everyone understands this, but like there is a security and life and safety issue, and how are those going to be maintained, and how are the fire suppression systems, for example, going to be maintained? On the security plan, I will say one of the things that people do get concerned about is, hey, there's nobody on site. Who do I call as the community planner? Who do I call if there's a problem and we got to get in there? Not just a fire safety or explosion or something like that, but like, if we encounter an issue, we need to have a point of contact. So that should be specified in there. Obviously, all the safety protocols and everything that's mentioned on the slide here. So I mentioned a couple of these already, weed maintenance, vegetation management, screening. If you had a condition in there about screening and the screening fails after a certain period of time, you're going to want to have that. Someone's got to come by and make sure that the screening is still in place and is performing as expected. If there is a road, that the road maintenance, and usually they're not, they're not highly perfected roads. They're typically crushed stone. Sometimes they're asphalt. That they got to be inspected so that you can get a truck on there if you need to. And all the inspections are happening. And then specifically on stormwater management, that the stormwater that there aren't any stormwater issues that were not properly addressed that need to be addressed during the operational phase. So these are all examples of things that you want to put in that operation and maintenance plan, that they're going to, if they have a culvert, that they're going to clean the culvert. If they have some sort of retaining pond, which they typically don't have to have, but that will be, functional into the future. All right, so I know we're running out of time here, so I'm going to have to speed up, but the decommissioning plan. So this is one to say you have a decommissioning plan and decommissioning agreement. We do recommend that you do both. Most people have a decommissioning plan, but we feel a decommissioning agreement is necessary as an add-on to the plan. So the decommissioning plan is something that gets addressed as part of that special use permit, right? So after 7 years, I think as our questioner said, but 20 years or 30 years, whatever the useful life of these things are, if at the end of that point that, there's no one there to take up the property again and say, okay, we're going to reinvest in this, what's the plan for the dismantling and the removal, and it should say disposal, although it doesn't say it on here, dismantling, removal, and disposal of all the project components, and then taking all the disturbed areas and reclaiming them through revegetation. So what would cause this facility age, some sort of a storm damage or other kinds of damage? It could be economic conditions. Solar is no longer feasible to keep going on. There might be a bankruptcy of a parent company. There could be anything that would be considered a reason for why there'd be a permanent closure. So the decommissioning agreement, why we recommend this over just a decommissioning plan, you should have both, is that a decommissioning plan, if they are in default of the decommissioning plan, it's harder to enforce, right? Like particularly if there's not a company that's still solvent that's standing behind it, and you just have a plan, then it can be harder to enforce it. And we'll talk about the bond in the next slide, but you could have a performance bond, essentially a performance bond. And if the company's bankrupt and there's no one resulting in this, you'd actually have to prove a default in the plan in order to collect on the bond. Whereas if you have a decommissioning agreement and they're in default of the agreement, that itself could trigger the bond paying out, potentially, right? So you enter, it's like a contract, basically. It's beyond just the special use permit. It's a contract saying who the responsible parties are, where who's going to pay for what, and exactly what the dollar value is and what the insurance plan is going to be like, or the bond in this particular case. So these are the requirements. Length of time from the point of the closure of the facility to when it's going to be done, who's going to be responsible, the things that are maybe not necessarily on the pad of the site, like lines going to a substation or something like that, if those have to be taken down, conduit structures, all that kind of stuff. Restoration of the property, time frame. The landowner, I'm sorry, that was the other thing I was going to say. In the agreement, you can tie in the landowner. It's very hard to tie in the landowner to the plan because the plan is for the operator, right? But the agreement, you can tie in the landowner. The landowner then is part of the decommissioning of it, not necessarily responsible for the decommissioning cost, but is tied into it. And so you have special rights with that you wouldn't have with just the plan. Decommissioning cost estimate. So on the cost estimate, that's the cost estimate that is used to establish the amount of the surety bond for the decommissioning. You want to have it prepared by a licensed professional. You don't want just simply this to be the company's, hey, we think it's going to cost this much. You're certainly entitled to a detailed breakdown, line item, mobilization, all the way through punch list, all that kind of stuff. Not only the removal of it, but the disposal of it. You want to have some sort of schedule for renewing the decommissioning plan and agreement and the bond associated with that. This is what I was saying before, don't include the salvage value. So if the company says it's going to cost us $500,000, but we can resell the panels for 200, so we should only need a bond for 300. We don't agree with that. You need the full $500,000 bonded. And that this has to be dealt with prior to the issuance of a permit, not something that they should do upon the certificate of completion, because obviously it's already installed at that point. So here's some pre-construction requirements. And again, I know we're running out of time here. So all these things, this slideshow is going to be available to you right after this. A lot of these things are on the website that I previously mentioned, mrb.com/solar. But these are all the different conditions that you want to have in there. And there in red is that irrevocable financial security bond related to decommissioning. I hope that this will never be needed. And I hope that all these solar projects will be indefinitely financially solvent, but you want to make sure that you're not going to be holding this into the future. We've had lots of experiences of other types of uses where that has been a plan, that has been a problem. Obviously, with respect to the pilot agreement and so on like that, all the other types of agreements, you want to wrap that into your conditions. Pre-construction meeting, we highly recommend, not just for solar projects, but for just about everything. You want to have all the interested and affected agencies be part of that, whether or not their attendance is physical or remotely. And you do want to have meeting minutes in case there's ever a disagreement later on about what happened at that pre-construction meeting. This is a typical agenda. Again, I'm not going to go through this. This will be available in all the cut sheets that we have on our website. So again, I know we're just about out of time here, so I will just say I do encourage people to visit that site. The Tioga County report goes into a tremendous amount of detail that I did not have time to cover today. And we have some examples about up there about some local laws and some decommissioning plans and a few of these bullet points that we have there. The battery storage law in particular, I think is one that's interesting. NYSERDA put one together as well. You can see my contact information on the lower right-hand side of the screen. If you want to talk to me about economic issues, and I can get you to the people who can tell you more about the permitting issues if that's a question that you have. So with that, I'm wrapped. Happy to take any other questions or any other discussions.
Yeah, just a super comprehensive from how these pilots can be set up to fund projects like this and be able to advance them, to the checks that need to be in place before these projects advance, and some of the back end on making sure the due diligence is there for if there's a change to the site after it's constructed. So I really figured you covered it from A to Z. So if folks do have additional questions, please use that Q&A or chat function. Michael can get to those there, or I'll add them into the presentation. Good to get them in there because then they're in the archives. They're in forever from the video archive. But yeah, Michael's contact information is on the screen there if you want to reach out to him directly and have more questions about his expertise on these types of programs. So I do want to thank you, Michael, for joining us. I want to thank MRB Group for sponsoring us as well. This has been just eye-opening from a perspective of somebody who's actually considering following along with solar initiatives in counties where we're talking about stormwater issues, and what types of review goes in for these solar projects is really eye-opening. So I appreciate the perspective on the other things like the bonding and pilots for these types of projects. So thanks for sharing that. I do want to give a plug for our session next week. And what a day and age we live in where I can give this plug. Next week, we're going to be talking about marijuana. It's 2022. We'll be talking about zoning and planning for marijuana manufacturing, distribution, and consumption sites. So, it's kind of funny to say next week we'll be talking about weed for a full hour. So hopefully folks can join us. Stay tuned to announcements about that session. And please share the word about registration. I know this is an emerging topic and people are really curious about the state's rules and regulations and what municipalities are doing to respond to this new opportunity for types of commercial activity or recreational activity in your municipalities. So yeah, I'll leave it there as it's 2:00. I know, people have places to go, people to see. So again, thank you, Michael. Thank you, MRB Group. And thanks to everyone for taking the time out this afternoon to join us. Keep an eye out 24 hours from now for your confirmation emails. And we'll post a video archive of this presentation on our Eventbrite site immediately following the session. So thank you very much again, everybody.
Thank you to CDRPC. Great sessions.
Yeah,
Thank you.
appreciate the
See ya.
opportunity to host. Bye-bye.